Before we begin the story, let us know where you're watching from by leaving a comment below. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Have a wonderful day. Enjoy the story, everyone. Sophie stood at the cracked mirror in her cramped attic bedroom, her reflection wavering like a ghost in the dim morning light. At 19, she possessed an ethereal beauty that seemed almost cruel given her circumstances. Luminescent pale skin that caught light like moonbeams, expressive sapphire eyes that held depths of sorrow beyond her years, and silken auburn hair that cascaded down her shoulders in perfect waves. "Sophie, get down here now." William's voice boomed from below, each word dripping with the familiar contempt that had colored her life for the past 4 years. She pressed her palms against the cool glass, steadying herself. 4 years since the accident. 4 years since her world had shattered along with the windshield of her parents' car on that rain-soaked Seattle highway. 4 years of being reminded daily that she was nothing more than an unwanted burden in the Carter household. The floorboards creaked under her bare feet as she descended the narrow staircase. Eleanor sat hunched over the kitchen table, her graying hair pulled into a severe bun, fingers wrapped around a chipped coffee mug like a weapon. William paced by the window, his heavy frame casting long shadows across the linoleum floor. "Sit," he commanded without looking at her. Sophie's heart hammered against her ribs. Something was different today. The air felt charged with a dangerous electricity, like the moments before a thunderstorm breaks. "We've made a decision about your future," Eleanor began, her voice flat and businesslike. "You're 19 now, old enough to stop being a drain on this household." "I work at the diner every day," Sophie whispered, confusion clouding her features. "I give you everything I earn." William spun around, his eyes hard as flint. "That pittance? You think that covers what you've cost us? The food, the shelter, the clothes on your back?" Sophie's throat constricted. She knew this conversation had been building for months, could feel it in the increasingly cold stares, the deliberate exclusion from family dinners, the way they spoke about her as if she weren't there. "There's a man," Eleanor continued, setting down her mug with deliberate precision, "a very wealthy man who's willing to take you off our hands." The words hit Sophie like ice water. "What do you mean?" "James. He owns half of Seattle's real estate empire." William's voice took on a reverent tone. "Worth billions, and he's agreed to marry you." Sophie's world tilted. "Marry me? But I don't even know him." "I've never met." "You don't need to know him," Eleanor snapped. "You need to be grateful. A man like that could have any woman he wants, and he's chosen you. Consider it the luckiest day of your pathetic life." "He's 49 years old," Sophie whispered, the number falling from her lips like a stone into deep water. William's laugh was harsh and mirthless. "So, you think some 20-year-old boy is going to give you the security James can? You think anyone else wants a parentless girl with nothing to her name?" Sophie's hands trembled in her lap. "Please, I don't want to marry anyone. I can work more hours." "I can. It's already decided." Eleanor cut her off. "The wedding is in 3 days. James's people will be here tomorrow to collect you and get you prepared." The kitchen walls seemed to close in around Sophie. 3 days. 72 hours before she would belong to a complete stranger, a man 30 years her senior, a man she'd never seen, never spoken to, never chosen. Why? The word escaped as barely a breath. William's expression softened for just a moment, and Sophie caught a glimpse of something that might have been guilt. Then his face hardened again. "Because we're drowning in debt, and James is paying enough to solve all our problems. Because you're our responsibility. And this is how we're handling it. Because life isn't fair, Sophie, and the sooner you learn that, the better." Sophie rose on unsteady legs, the room spinning around her like a carnival ride. I need some air." "You need to start accepting reality," Eleanor called after her as Sophie stumbled toward the back door. "Grow up, girl. This is your chance at a real life." Outside, Sophie collapsed onto the rusted porch swing, her body shaking with silent sobs. The autumn wind whipped through the bare tree branches, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and coming winter. She pulled her thin cardigan tighter around her shoulders and stared up at the gray sky. 3 days to say goodbye to the only life she'd ever known. 3 days before she became the property of a man who could buy and sell her like a business transaction. 3 days before Sophie ceased to exist. As the first drops of rain began to fall, Sophie closed her eyes and whispered a prayer to parents who could no longer hear her. Help me be strong enough for what's coming. But deep in her heart, she wondered if any amount of strength could prepare her for James. James stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office on the 52nd floor of the Harrison Tower. His imposing 6'3" frame silhouetted against the Seattle skyline. At 49, he commanded respect and fear in equal measure throughout the business world. His salt-and-pepper hair was perfectly styled, his charcoal suit tailored to perfection, and his steel-blue eyes missed nothing. But today, those eyes held an emotion rarely seen in the corporate world. Uncertainty. "Sir," his assistant, Thomas, knocked softly on the office door. "The papers you requested." James turned, his expression carefully neutral. "Come in." Thomas approached the massive mahogany desk and set down a manila folder. Inside were photographs and documents about Sophie, the girl he was supposed to marry in 2 days. James had seen her picture, of course, had studied it during the negotiations with her uncle, but looking at it now, he felt an unexpected tightness in his chest. She was beautiful, yes, but it was more than that. There was something in her eyes, a combination of vulnerability and quiet strength, that seemed to reach through the photograph and touch something deep inside him. "Have you reconsidered, sir?" Thomas asked carefully. He'd been James's right-hand man for 15 years and was one of the few people brave enough to question his decisions. James lifted Sophie's photograph with surprisingly gentle fingers. "She's just a child, Thomas. She's 19, sir. Legally an adult." "Legally?" "Yes." James set the photo down and moved to the window again. "But what kind of man am I to marry a girl young enough to be my daughter?" Thomas remained silent. He knew James well enough to recognize when his boss was working through something internally. "Do you know why I agreed to this arrangement?" James asked suddenly. "I assumed it was for business reasons, sir. The Carter property portfolio could—" "No." James's voice was quiet. "It has nothing to do with business." He turned back to Thomas, and for a moment, the carefully constructed mask slipped. Thomas saw not the feared corporate titan, but a lonely man approaching 50 who had spent so many years building an empire that he'd forgotten to build a life. "I'm dying, Thomas." "Not literally," James added quickly, seeing Thomas's alarmed expression, "but inside. I wake up every morning in this penthouse that could house 20 families. I eat breakfast alone. I go to meetings where people tell me what they think I want to hear, and I come home to silence. I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes, and it means nothing." Thomas had never heard James speak this way. In all their years together, his boss had never revealed such vulnerability. "When William approached me about his niece," James continued, "something inside me stirred for the first time in years, not desire for money or power, but hope. Hope that maybe I could have what other men take for granted. A family, someone who might actually miss me if I didn't come home. But sir, she doesn't even know you. She's being forced into this." James's jaw tightened. "I know. And that's what makes me a monster, isn't it? I'm so desperate for companionship that I'm willing to buy a bride. You could call it off," Thomas suggested quietly. James was silent for a long moment, staring at Sophie's photograph. "I could, but then what happens to her? William is drowning in gambling debts. If I don't marry her, he'll sell her to someone else. At least with me, she'll be safe. She'll be protected. You're not doing this for yourself." Thomas realized. "You're doing it to save her." James's laugh was bitter. "Am I? Or am I just telling myself that to feel better about what I'm doing?" He picked up another document from the folder. Sophie's background report. Orphaned at 15, parents killed in a car accident, taken in by relatives who clearly saw her as a burden, working at a diner to pay her own way. Despite everything, she'd maintained excellent grades in high school and had dreams of attending college to study literature. "She wanted to be a teacher," James murmured, reading from the report. "She loves books. She volunteers at the local children's hospital on weekends, reading stories to sick kids." The picture that emerged was of a young woman who, despite facing tragedy and hardship, had retained her compassion and dreams. James felt something crack inside his chest. "I'm going to ruin her life," he said quietly. "Or you might save it," Thomas countered. "Sir, if I may speak freely, James nodded. In the 15 years I've worked for you, I've watched you transform from a driven young entrepreneur into the most successful businessman in Seattle. You've built an empire. You've created thousands of jobs. You've donated millions to charity. But you've never allowed yourself to be happy. Maybe this is your chance, at the expense of a 19-year-old girl who has no choice in the matter. Then give her a choice, Thomas said simply. Marry her as planned, but make it clear that she can leave whenever she wants. No strings attached. Give her the security and protection she needs, but also give her the freedom to choose her own path. James stared at his assistant. You're suggesting I enter into a marriage with an exit clause. I'm suggesting you show her the same kindness you show everyone else in your life, just more personally. James walked back to his desk and picked up Sophie's photograph one more time. Tomorrow, this beautiful, innocent girl would become his wife. The thought both thrilled and terrified him. Double her uncle's payment, he said suddenly. Whatever we agreed to pay William, double it and set up a trust fund for Sophie, something she can access independently. If she decides to leave, I want her to have the means to start over anywhere she chooses. Thomas made notes quickly. Anything else? James was quiet for a moment, then said, Find out her favorite flowers, her favorite books, anything that might make this easier for her. As Thomas left the office, James remained at the window, watching the sun set over the city he'd conquered. Tomorrow, he would meet the girl who might finally make all his success mean something, or he would become the villain in her story forever. Sophie stared at herself in the three-way mirror of Seattle's most exclusive bridal boutique, feeling like she was looking at a stranger. The wedding dress was a masterpiece. Ivory silk that flowed like water, delicate beading that caught the light with every breath, and a neckline that was elegant without being revealing. It fit her perfectly, as if it had been made specifically for her body, which, she realized with a start, it probably had been. Absolutely stunning, gushed the boutique owner, a thin woman named Clara, who had been hired by James's people to ensure Sophie looked perfect for the wedding. Mr. Harrison has exquisite taste. Sophie's reflection stared back at her with hollow eyes. He chose this dress? Oh, yes, dear. He was very specific about what he wanted. Nothing too revealing, nothing too modern. Classic elegance, he said. Something that would make you look like the princess you're about to become. A princess. Sophie almost laughed at the absurdity. Princesses in fairy tales chose their princes. They weren't sold to them by desperate relatives. And the shoes, Clara continued, kneeling to adjust the hem. Perfect height. Mr. Harrison didn't want you to be uncomfortable during the ceremony. Despite herself, Sophie felt a flicker of surprise. She'd expected a man who would buy a bride to care little about her comfort, but every detail of the wedding preparations had shown an unexpected thoughtfulness. The dress was beautiful but modest. The makeup artist had been instructed to enhance her natural beauty, not transform her into someone else. Even the flowers, white lilies, and baby's breath were exactly what she would have chosen herself if anyone had asked. There's more, Clara said, producing a small velvet box. From your fiancé. Sophie's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a delicate necklace, a single pearl on a gold chain, simple, elegant, and somehow perfect for the dress. The note inside read, I hope this brings you comfort. Jay? He has wonderful taste, Clara observed, and clearly adores you already. Sophie wanted to laugh or cry or scream. Instead, she stood perfectly still as Clara fastened the necklace around her throat. The pearl felt warm against her skin, and she wondered briefly what James's hands would feel like when he inevitably touched her. The thought made her shudder. Pre-wedding nerves? Clara asked kindly. Perfectly normal, dear. Every bride feels overwhelmed. Did every bride also meet her groom for the first time at the altar? Sophie asked quietly. Clara's hands stilled. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. You haven't met him yet? Sophie shook her head, not trusting her voice. Oh, sweetheart. Clara moved around to face her. I've worked with Mr. Harrison on several charity events over the years. Whatever you're imagining about him, whatever fears you have, he's not a cruel man. Demanding, yes. Powerful, absolutely. But not cruel. He's 49 years old, Sophie whispered. And you're 19. I know how that must seem to you." Clara's voice was gentle, but age is just a number. I've seen couples with decades between them who were blissfully happy, and couples the same age who couldn't stand each other. Sophie met Clara's eyes in the mirror. What if he expects things from me that I can't give? Understanding dawned in Clara's expression. "Oh, honey, have you never been with a man before?" Sophie's cheeks flamed red, which was answer enough. Clara's hands found Sophie's shoulders, squeezing gently. "Listen to me carefully. James has a reputation in this city, and it's not for being heartless with women. Quite the opposite, actually. The few relationships I've heard about over the years, he's known for being a gentleman, patient, kind. But I'm not someone he chose to date," Sophie said. "I'm someone he bought." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Why do you think he chose you?" "Because my uncle owed him money." "No, they are." "Why you specifically?" "A man like James could have any woman in Seattle, socialites, models, actresses, women who would marry him gladly for his money and status. Why do you think he chose a 19-year-old girl he'd never met?" Sophie had wondered about this herself. "I don't know. Maybe," Clara said carefully, "he's as lonely as you are." The words hit Sophie like a physical blow. Lonely? Yes, that was exactly what she was. Had been for 4 years now, ever since her parents died. But the idea that a billionaire could be lonely seemed impossible. "Men like him have everything," Sophie said. "Everything except what matters most," Clara replied. "Love, family, someone who cares about them for who they are, not what they can provide." Sophie studied her reflection again. The girl in the mirror looked like someone from a magazine, polished, elegant, expensive, but her eyes still held the fear of a cornered animal. "What if I disappoint him?" she whispered. "What if you don't?" Clara countered. "What if this is exactly what both of you need?" As Sophie changed back into her regular clothes, she couldn't shake Clara's words. That night, lying in her narrow attic bed for the last time, she stared at the ceiling and tried to imagine what tomorrow would bring. In 12 hours, she would walk down the aisle of St. Patrick's Cathedral. In 12 hours, she would promise to love, honor, and obey a man she'd never spoken to. In 12 hours, Sophie Carter would cease to exist, and Mrs. James Harrison would be born. The pearl necklace sat on her nightstand, catching moonlight from the window. Despite everything, despite her terror and uncertainty, there was something about that necklace that made her feel not alone. Tomorrow, she would meet the man who had chosen her. Tomorrow, her real life would begin. She just prayed she would be strong enough to survive it. The cathedral doors seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds as Sophie stood before them, her arm linked through William's. Through the oak panels, she could hear the soft murmur of voices and the delicate notes of a string quartet. Her bouquet of white lilies trembled in her free hand. "Remember," William muttered under his breath, his fingers digging into her arm, "smile, and don't embarrass us. This is the best thing that could have happened to you." Sophie nodded numbly, her throat too tight to speak. Through the sheer fabric of her veil, everything looked dreamlike and unreal. Any moment now, she would meet the man who owned her future. The doors opened, and Sophie's breath caught in her throat. St. Patrick's Cathedral had been transformed into something from a fairy tale. Hundreds of white lilies and baby's breath lined the pews. Soft candlelight bathed everything in a golden glow, and the afternoon sun streaming through the stained glass windows painted rainbow patterns across the stone floor. But Sophie barely noticed any of it. Her eyes were fixed on the figure standing at the altar. James was nothing like what she had imagined. He was tall, yes, and impeccably dressed in a midnight blue suit that emphasized his broad shoulders. His hair was silver-touched at the temples, and his features were strong and aristocratic. But it was his eyes that stopped her cold. They weren't the cold, calculating eyes of a predator she'd expected. They were warm, kind, and filled with something she couldn't quite identify. Was that nervousness? As the music swelled and Sophie began her walk down the aisle, she watched James's face transform. His formal expression melted into something softer, more vulnerable. His lips parted slightly, as if he'd forgotten to breathe. When their eyes met across the length of the cathedral, Sophie felt an unexpected jolt of electricity. He was handsome, devastatingly so, despite the age difference. But more than that, he looked gentle. Step by step, She moved closer, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could see him more clearly now. The slight tremor in his hands as he adjusted his tie, the way his eyes never left her face, the small, almost uncertain smile that played at the corners of his mouth. When she finally reached the altar, William placed her hand in James's without ceremony and quickly stepped back. Sophie found herself standing mere inches from the man who would be her husband, staring up into eyes that were the color of storm clouds. "Hello, Sophie," James said softly, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "You look absolutely beautiful." His hand was warm around hers, his touch gentle rather than possessive. Sophie had expected roughness, dominance, immediate claims of ownership. Instead, James held her hand as if she were made of spun glass. "Thank you," she whispered, surprised that her voice worked at all. The ceremony began, but Sophie heard very little of it. She was too focused on the man beside her, trying to reconcile her expectations with reality. James responded to the priest's words in a clear, steady voice, but Sophie noticed that his thumb was tracing small, soothing circles on the back of her hand. Was he trying to comfort her? When it came time for vows, James turned to face her fully. The priest handed him the ring. A simple platinum band with a single perfect diamond. As he slid it onto her finger, his eyes never left hers. "Sophie," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the cathedral, but somehow feeling intimate and private. "I promise to honor you, to protect you, and to ensure that you never want for anything. I promise to be patient, to be kind, and to earn whatever trust you might someday choose to give me." The words weren't traditional vows, and Sophie realized with a start that he had written them himself. They were a promise, yes, but also an acknowledgement of their unusual circumstances. He was promising to earn her trust, not demanding it as his right. When it was Sophie's turn, she found herself staring into James's eyes and speaking words she hadn't planned. "I promise to try, James, to give this marriage a chance, to see you for who you are, not who I feared you might be." Something shifted in James's expression. Relief, gratitude, hope. "You may kiss the bride," the priest announced. Sophie's breath caught. This was it, the moment she'd been dreading most. She closed her eyes and waited for James to claim what was now legally his. Instead, she felt the whisper-soft brush of his lips against her forehead. When she opened her eyes in surprise, James was smiling at her with such tenderness that her knees nearly buckled. "That's all for now," he murmured so quietly that only she could hear. "We'll take everything else as slowly as you need." As they turned to face their guests, Sophie's mind reeled. This wasn't the monster she'd imagined. This wasn't a man who would take what he wanted without regard for her feelings. This was someone who seemed to genuinely care about her comfort and consent. The receiving line passed in a blur of congratulations and well wishes from people Sophie didn't recognize. Seattle's social elite, business associates, distant relatives, who had suddenly become very interested in reconnecting with the Carters now that Sophie had married into money. Through it all, James stayed close to her side, his hand warm and steady on the small of her back. When someone spoke to her, he included her in the conversation. When she looked overwhelmed, he smoothly redirected attention to himself. When an older man made a comment about how lucky James was to have such a young bride, James's voice took on a steel edge as he replied, "I'm the lucky one. Sophie is remarkable." At the reception, James led her onto the dance floor for their first dance as husband and wife. Sophie had never been held by a man before, and she tensed as his arms encircled her. But James held her respectfully, one hand on her waist, the other holding her hand, maintaining a proper distance between their bodies. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly as they swayed to the music. Sophie looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of deception or hidden cruelty. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone who would see me as property, someone cold and demanding." And she trailed off, unable to finish. "Someone who would hurt you," James said gently. Sophie nodded, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. James's arms tightened around her protectively. "Sophie, I need you to understand something. Whatever else happens between us, I will never, ever hurt you. Not physically, not emotionally, if I can help it. You have my word on that." "Why?" The question escaped before she could stop it. "Why did you choose me?" Clara said you could have any woman in Seattle. James was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant. Because, he said finally, I saw your picture and recognized something in your eyes. The same loneliness I see in my mirror every morning. I hoped, that maybe we could be less lonely together. The honesty in his voice made Sophie's chest tight. I am lonely, she admitted. So am I, James replied. But maybe we don't have to be anymore. As the song ended and other couples joined them on the dance floor, Sophie found herself thinking that maybe, just maybe, this wouldn't be the nightmare she'd imagined. Maybe William had been right about one thing. This might be the best thing that could have happened to her. But the real test would come tonight, when they were alone together for the first time as husband and wife. The penthouse elevator climbed silently toward the 50th floor, each passing number making Sophie's heart race faster. James stood beside her, hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable. The wedding reception had ended an hour ago, and now they were alone together for the first time as husband and wife. Sophie, James said quietly, as the elevator approached their floor, I want you to know that there are no expectations tonight. None at all. Sophie turned to look at him, surprised by the gentleness in his voice. What do you mean? I mean that this is your home now, and you should feel safe here. Whatever happens between us, if anything ever does, will be entirely your choice. The elevator doors opened to reveal a stunning foyer with marble floors and crystal chandeliers. James placed his hand lightly on Sophie's lower back, guiding her forward, but she could feel the hesitation in his touch. Welcome home, Mrs. Harrison, he said softly. The penthouse was breathtaking. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Seattle's skyline, twinkling with a million lights. The furniture was elegant but comfortable, the decor sophisticated without being cold. Fresh white lilies, Sophie's favorites, filled crystal vases throughout the living room. You remembered the lilies, Sophie said, touching one of the perfect blooms. I had my assistant find out what you liked, James admitted. I wanted you to feel welcome. Sophie wandered through the space, taking in every detail. The kitchen was a chef's dream. The dining room could seat one too, and the living room was larger than her uncle's entire house. But it was the small touches that caught her attention. The stack of classic literature on the coffee table, all books she'd mentioned loving in high school, and the soft throw blanket draped over the sofa that looked perfect for reading. The guest bedroom is down this hall, James said, opening a door to reveal a beautifully appointed room with its own bathroom. I thought you might prefer your own space, at least initially. Sophie stared at the room. It was gorgeous. A queen. Sized bed with Egyptian cotton linens, a reading nook by the window, even a small desk if she wanted to write. This is for me? Of course. You're not a prisoner here, Sophie. You're my wife, and this is your home. You should have whatever you need to feel comfortable. Where will you sleep? She asked quietly. James gestured vaguely toward the other end of the penthouse. The master bedroom is over there, but please don't feel any pressure. We can live as roommates for as long as you need. Sophie sat down on the edge of the bed, her wedding dress pooling around her like spilled cream. The events of the day suddenly crashed over her. The ceremony, meeting James, the realization that he wasn't the monster she'd feared. She began to cry, not from fear this time, but from relief and overwhelming emotion. James appeared in the doorway instantly, concern etched on his features. Sophie, what's wrong? Did I say something? No, she said quickly, wiping her eyes. You've been nothing but kind. I was so scared. For days, I imagined the worst possible things, and you've been human. More than human, James suggested with a rueful smile. Sophie laughed through her tears. More than human. You've been wonderful. James stepped into the room, but maintained a respectful distance. I know this situation isn't ideal. I know you didn't choose this any more than you chose to lose your parents or live with relatives who didn't appreciate you, but I hope in time you might find some happiness here. Can I ask you something? Sophie said, looking up at him through her lashes. Anything. Why haven't you ever married before? You're successful, handsome, kind. Surely women have been interested. James leaned against the doorframe, his expression thoughtful. "I've dated, of course, but the women who were interested in me were usually interested in my money or status. I could never tell if they cared about James the man or James the bank account. And you think I'm different because I was forced into this?" "I think you're different because you have no choice but to see me as I really am," James said. "You can't pretend to love me for my money because you didn't choose to be here. If you ever come to care for me, it will be because of who I am as a person, not what I can provide. That's something I've never had before." Sophie considered this. "That's a lonely way to live." "Very lonely," James agreed. "What about you? No boyfriend? No one you had to leave behind?" Sophie shook her head. "I never had time for dating between school and work and dealing with my aunt and uncle. And after my parents died, I just couldn't imagine trusting anyone enough to love them. Because love hurts when you lose it," James said quietly. "Exactly." Sophie met his eyes. "How do you know that?" "Because I loved my parents too. They died when I was 25, both of them within 6 months of each other. I threw myself into building my business after that, told myself I didn't need anyone else. But building an empire doesn't keep you warm at night." They were both quiet for a moment, the weight of shared understanding settling between them. "Sophie," James said finally, "I want you to know that you can trust me not just with your safety, but with your heart if you ever choose to share it. I won't rush you or pressure you or expect anything you're not ready to give." Sophie stood and walked over to where he stood in the doorway. This close, she could smell his cologne, something expensive but not overwhelming. She could see the flecks of blue in his gray eyes, the slight lines at their corners that spoke of a man who smiled often despite his loneliness. "Can I ask you for something?" she said quietly. "Of course. Can you help me out of this dress? The buttons are impossible to reach." James's breath caught. "Sophie, I don't think—" "Please," she said simply. "I trust you." Something shifted in James's expression. Slowly, carefully, he turned her around so she was facing away from him. His fingers were gentle as they worked the tiny pearl buttons that ran down the back of her dress, each one revealing a small expanse of pale skin. Sophie could feel his breath on her neck, could sense the controlled restraint in every movement. When the last button was undone, James immediately stepped back. "There," he said, his voice slightly rough. "Good night, Sophie." "James," she called as he turned to leave. "Yes?" "Thank you for everything today. For being gentle with me." James's smile was soft and genuine. "Thank you for giving me a chance to be better than you expected." After he left, Sophie changed into the silk nightgown that had been left for her another thoughtful touch, as it was modest and beautiful rather than revealing. As she brushed out her hair and prepared for bed, she found herself thinking about the man who was now her husband. He had every legal right to demand intimacy from her, every right to expect her submission and gratitude. Instead, he had given her space, respect, and, most surprisingly, the beginning of hope that this marriage might become something real. As Sophie settled into her new bed, she found herself wondering what it would be like to kiss James properly. The thought should have terrified her, but instead it filled her with a strange warmth. Maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to understand what Clara had meant about lonely people finding each other. Sophie woke to the smell of coffee and something delicious cooking in the kitchen. For a moment, she forgot where she was, expecting to see the cracked ceiling of her attic bedroom. Instead, she found herself surrounded by luxury, Egyptian cotton sheets, down pillows, and sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of Puget Sound. The events of yesterday came flooding back. The wedding, James, the gentle way he had unbuttoned her dress and then immediately stepped away, giving her space when he could have taken so much more. Sophie slipped on the silk robe that had been laid out for her and padded barefoot toward the kitchen. She found James standing at the stove, dressed casually in dark jeans and a white button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He looked younger somehow, less intimidating than the imposing businessman from the wedding. "Good morning," he said, turning with a warm smile. "I hope I didn't wake you. I wasn't sure what you liked for breakfast, so I made a little of everything." The kitchen island was laden with fresh fruit, croissants, eggs, Benedict, and what appeared to be homemade pancakes. The coffee smelled like heaven. "You cooked all this?" Sophie asked, surprised. James chuckled. Don't look so shocked. I've been living alone for years. I had to learn to cook or survive on takeout. Besides, I enjoy it. It's relaxing. Sophie accepted the cup of coffee he offered her, inhaling the rich aroma. I wouldn't have expected a billionaire to cook his own breakfast. Most people wouldn't, but money can't buy everything, Sophie. It can't buy the satisfaction of creating something with your own hands or the pleasure of taking care of someone you. He trailed off, as if catching himself before he said too much. Someone you… What? Sophie asked softly. James's eyes met hers across the kitchen island. Someone you're beginning to care about. The simple honesty of his words made Sophie's heart skip. We barely know each other. That's true, James agreed, beginning to plate the food. But I know that you're brave enough to volunteer at a children's hospital despite having lost your own parents. I know that you worked every day to contribute to a household where you weren't wanted. I know that you walked down that aisle yesterday with grace and dignity, even though you were terrified. How do you know all that? I had my people find out everything they could about you before the wedding, James admitted. I hope that doesn't upset you. I needed to know who you were, what kind of person I was asking to share my life. Sophie considered this as she accepted the plate he offered her. What else did you find out? That you got straight A's in high school despite working 20 hours a week. That you saved every penny you could for college, even though your aunt and uncle took most of your paycheck. That the children at the hospital ask for you specifically because you do all the character voices when you read to them. You had someone watch me read to children, Sophie asked, not sure whether to be touched or disturbed. I had someone confirm that you were exactly who I hoped you were, James said gently. A good person who deserved better than the situation she'd been given. They ate breakfast in comfortable silence for a while, Sophie marveling at how normal this felt. She'd expected awkwardness, tension, perhaps demands about their future together. Instead, James seemed content to simply share a meal with her. What happens now? Sophie asked finally. What do you mean? I mean, what are we to each other? How does this work? James set down his fork and looked at her seriously. We're married, Sophie. Legally, you're my wife, and I'm your husband. But beyond that, we can be whatever we choose to be. Friends, if that's all you're comfortable with. Partners, if we find we work well together. Something more, if that develops naturally. And if it doesn't, if we never become what you hoped for. James's expression was patient and kind. Then we'll be two people who treated each other with kindness and respect for however long we're together. There are worse ways to live. Sophie studied his face, looking for any sign of deception or hidden agenda. You really mean that, don't you? I do, Sophie. I've lived alone for 24 years. I'm not going to die of loneliness if we remain platonic roommates. But I am hoping that, given time, we might become friends at least. I'd like that, Sophie said quietly. I've never really had a friend before. Never? Sophie shook her head. Moving in with my aunt and uncle meant changing schools. I was too busy working to make friends in high school. And my parents… She paused, her throat tightening. They were my best friends. After they died, I just shut down. James reached across the table and covered her hand with his. I'm sorry. I know what it's like to lose the people who matter most. How did you do it? How did you keep going? Honestly, I buried myself in work. I built this empire partly to honor their memory, but mostly to avoid dealing with the grief. It wasn't healthy, but it got me through. Sophie turned her hand palm up beneath his, their fingers intertwining naturally. Do you think they would be proud of you? James's smile was soft and a little sad. I hope so. I think they'd be more proud of the man I'm trying to become than the one I've been. What kind of man have you been? Driven, successful, but also closed off. I haven't let anyone close enough to really know me in years. I've been existing rather than living. And what kind of man do you want to become? James's thumb traced across her knuckles, the touch sending unexpected warmth up Sophie's arm. The kind who deserves someone like you. Patient, kind, present. The kind who builds a life, not just a business. Sophie felt something shift inside her chest. This man, who could have any woman in Seattle, who could have demanded anything from her, was telling her that he wanted to become worthy of her. It was so different from what she'd expected that she felt disoriented. "James," she said carefully, "yesterday, you said you recognized loneliness in my eyes. What else did you see?" James was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes searching her face. "Strength," he said finally. "Resilience. Beauty, obviously, but not just physical beauty. There was something about your expression that made me think, here's someone who's been broken but not beaten. Someone who still has hope despite everything she's been through. I don't feel very hopeful most of the time. But you're here," James pointed out. "You could have run away before the wedding. You could have refused to speak to me yesterday. Instead, you're sitting here having breakfast with me, holding my hand, giving this marriage a chance. That's hope, Sophie." Looking down at their joined hands, Sophie realized he was right. Despite her fears, despite the unconventional circumstances, something inside her was cautiously optimistic about this man and the life he was offering her. "So, what do we do today?" she asked. "Whatever you want," James said. "I took the week off work so we could figure each other out. I suppose we could explore the city, stay in and talk, go shopping for anything you need. Your choice." Sophie smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. "I'd like to stay in and talk. I want to know more about the man I married." James's answering smile was brilliant. "I'd like that very much." As they cleared the breakfast dishes together, moving around each other in the kitchen with surprising ease, Sophie found herself thinking that maybe this arrangement wouldn't be a prison after all. Maybe it would be a sanctuary. 3 weeks into their marriage, Sophie and James had settled into a rhythm that surprised them both with its naturalness. Their days were filled with long conversations, shared meals, and a growing comfort in each other's presence. James had shown Sophie around Seattle, taking her to museums, theaters, and bookstores that made her eyes light up with genuine joy. In return, Sophie had begun to see glimpses of the man behind the corporate facade, someone who was gentle, intelligent, and desperately hungry for authentic connection. But tonight felt different. A storm raged outside the penthouse windows, and Sophie couldn't sleep. She'd been dreaming about her parents again, the recurring nightmare that had plagued her since their death. She was in the car with them, could see the other vehicle approaching, could feel the moment of impact, but was always powerless to stop it. Sophie jerked awake with a strangled cry, her heart racing and tears streaming down her face. The guest bedroom suddenly felt too small, too isolated. Without thinking, she slipped out of bed and padded barefoot through the darkened penthouse toward the living room. She found James there, standing by the windows in a dark robe, watching the lightning illuminate the sky. He turned when he heard her footsteps, and his expression immediately shifted to concern when he saw her tear-stained face. "Sophie, what's wrong?" "I'm sorry," she whispered, wrapping her arms around herself. "I didn't mean to disturb you. I had the dream again." James moved toward her without hesitation. "The same one?" Sophie nodded. Over the past weeks, they'd shared pieces of their past with each other, and she had told him about the nightmares that had haunted her for 4 years. "Come here," James said gently, settling onto the large sofa and opening his arms. Sophie hesitated for only a moment before moving into his embrace. He held her carefully, one hand smoothing her hair while the other rubbed soothing circles on her back. She could feel the warmth of his body through his robe, smell the clean scent of his skin, and gradually her breathing began to slow. "Tell me about them," James said quietly. "Your parents?" "Not about the accident, but about who they were." Sophie pressed her face against his chest, finding comfort in the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "My mom was a teacher, elementary school. She used to say that every child deserved to feel special, and she made sure they did. She'd spend her own money on classroom supplies, stay late to help struggling students, attend every school play and sports event. She sounds wonderful. She was. And my dad, he was an architect. He designed houses, but not just any houses. He specialized in accessible designs for families with disabled children. He said everyone deserved a home that fit their needs." Sophie's voice grew thick with emotion. "They were good people, James. Really good. And they loved each other so much." James's arms tightened around her. "They sound like they loved you very much, too." "They did. They made me feel like I was the most important thing in their world. Sophie's voice broke. When they died, it felt like all the love in my life died with them. But it didn't, James said firmly. That love is still there, Sophie. It's part of who you are. I can see it in the way you interact with people, in your kindness and compassion. Your parents may be gone, but the love they gave you lives on. Sophie pulled back to look at him, surprised by the intensity in his voice. How can you be so sure? Because I see what they created, James said, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. They raised a woman who volunteers with sick children despite her own trauma, who worked tirelessly to support relatives who didn't appreciate her, who was brave enough to marry a stranger because she had no other choice, but kind enough to give him a chance to prove he wasn't a monster. James, Sophie whispered, leaning into his touch. I see a woman who's been through unimaginable loss but still has room in her heart for hope. That didn't come from nowhere, Sophie. That came from being loved unconditionally for the first 15 years of your life. Sophie felt fresh tears spring to her eyes. But these were different from the tears of grief she was accustomed to. These were tears of recognition, of healing, of someone finally understanding the depth of her loss and the strength it had taken to survive it. I miss them so much, she whispered. I know you do, and you always will. But Sophie, they wouldn't want your life to end with theirs. They'd want you to find love again, to build a family, to be happy. What if I don't know how anymore? What if I'm too broken? James's thumb brushed away her tears. You're not broken. Wounded, yes. Grieving, absolutely. But not broken. Do you know how I know? Sophie shook her head. Because 3 weeks ago, a terrified 9-year-old girl married a stranger 30 years older than her, and instead of hiding in her room or treating me like the enemy, she chose to see me as a person. She chose to share meals with me, to talk with me, to let me hold her when she's hurting. That's not the behavior of a broken person, Sophie. That's the behavior of someone with an extraordinary capacity for healing and growth. Sophie stared into his eyes, seeing something there she hadn't noticed before. James, are you? Do you have feelings for me? Real feelings? James was quiet for a long moment, his hand still cradling her face. Yes, he said finally. I do. I'm falling in love with you, Sophie. Not with the idea of you, not with your beauty, though you're breathtaking. I'm falling in love with your strength, your kindness, your resilience. I'm falling in love with the woman who makes pancakes on Saturday mornings and argues with me about books and laughs at my terrible jokes. Sophie's breath caught. James, I know it's too soon, he continued quickly. I know our situation is complicated and unconventional. I'm not asking you to feel the same way. I needed you to know that this isn't just gratitude or loneliness talking. What I feel for you is real. Sophie studied his face, seeing the vulnerability there, the fear that he'd said too much too soon, but she also saw the truth of his words in his eyes. I think, she said carefully, that I might be falling in love with you too. James's expression transformed, hope blooming across his features. Really? You're not who I expected, Sophie said, her hand coming up to rest against his chest. When I imagined my husband, I pictured someone demanding, controlling, selfish. Instead, I got someone who cooks me breakfast, who listens to my fears, who holds me when I have nightmares, and doesn't expect anything in return. Sophie, James said, his voice rough with emotion. I got someone who sees the best in me, even when I can't see it myself, she continued. Someone who makes me feel safe and valued and cherished. You're cherished, James said fiercely. More than you know. Sophie leaned forward until their foreheads touched. I'm scared, James. I've never felt this way about anyone before. I'm scared, too, he admitted. I never thought I'd have this chance. I never thought someone like you would want someone like me, someone older, set in my ways, damaged by years of living without real connection. Sophie smiled softly. You're not damaged. You're just careful, protective of your heart. I understand that. So, what do we do now? James asked. Sophie's answer was to close the small distance between them and press her lips softly to his. The kiss was gentle, tentative, but it sent electricity racing through both of them. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. Now, Sophie said, we stop being afraid of what this might become and start letting it happen naturally. James's smile was radiant. I love you, Sophie Harrison. I love you too, James Harrison. Outside, the storm continued to rage. But inside the penthouse, two lonely hearts had finally found their home in each other. 2 months into their marriage, Sophie woke to find James's side of the bed empty. Yes, side of the bed. They'd been sharing the master bedroom for the past month, though their physical relationship had progressed slowly and gently, always at Sophie's pace. She found him in his home office, hunched over his laptop despite it being barely dawn. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his hair was disheveled, as if he'd been running his hands through it. James, Sophie approached cautiously, recognizing the signs of stress she'd learned to read in him. What's wrong? He looked up, his expression haggard. I'm sorry. Did I wake you? No, but you should have. How long have you been up? A few hours. James scrubbed his face with his hands. There's a problem with the Anderson acquisition. If I don't handle this correctly, it could cost thousands of jobs. Sophie moved behind his chair and began massaging his tense shoulders. Over the past weeks, they'd learned each other's comfort languages. She craved verbal affirmation and gentle touch, while he responded to acts of service and physical comfort. Tell me about it, she said simply. James leaned into her touch, some of the tension leaving his frame. Anderson Manufacturing has been family-owned for 3 generations. They're struggling financially, and I've been working on acquiring them to save the company and preserve the jobs. But Anderson's son wants to sell to a competitor who will strip the assets and close the factories. How many people would lose their jobs? 3,000. Sophie's hands stilled. 3,000 families. Exactly. And I can't figure out how to make the math work. I can pay more than the competitor, but Anderson Sr. is old school. He doesn't trust corporate raiders, and he sees me as just another shark. Are you? Sophie asked gently. A shark, I mean. James turned in his chair to face her. Sometimes, when I have to be, but not with this. This is about preserving something good, something that matters. Sophie studied his face, seeing the genuine concern there. This was the man she'd fallen in love with. Someone who'd built an empire but still cared about the human cost of his decisions. What if you met with them together? Anderson and his son. I've tried. The son won't even take my calls anymore. What if you didn't go as James Harrison, Billionaire CEO? What if you went as James Harrison, man who cares about working families? James frowned. What do you mean? Sophie perched on the arm of his chair. You told me your father was a factory worker before he started his own business. You know what it's like to worry about layoffs, to have your family's security depend on someone else's decisions. What if you shared that with them? Business isn't personal, Sophie. Isn't it? She challenged gently. For Anderson Sr., this company is his father's legacy and his son's inheritance. For those 3,000 workers, it's their children's futures. How is that not personal? James was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. You think I should show vulnerability? I think you should show them who you really are, not the corporate shark, but the man who sits up all night worrying about people he's never met because he knows what it's like to be powerless. A slow smile spread across James's features. You know what? You might be onto something. Of course I am, Sophie said with mock arrogance. I'm very wise. James laughed, pulling her down onto his lap. Yes, you are. What else do you suggest, oh wise one? Take me with you. What, Sophie? This is a business meeting. Exactly. And I'm not just your wife. I'm someone who understands what it's like to lose everything and depend on the kindness of others. Anderson Sr. might see me as proof that you're not just a calculating businessman. James studied her face. You'd really want to do that? It could be uncomfortable. James, I want to be part of your life, all of it. The good and the difficult. Let me help you. 3 days later, Sophie found herself sitting across from George Anderson and his son Michael in a small conference room at Anderson Manufacturing. The factory floor was visible through glass windows, and Sophie could see workers going about their daily tasks, unaware that their futures hung in the balance. Mr. Anderson, James began, I want to thank you for agreeing to meet with us. George Anderson was a man in his 72nd, with calloused hands and sharp eyes. He looked at James with undisguised suspicion. I'm only here because your wife asked nicely. But I still don't trust corporate types. I understand, James said. And I want to be honest with you about why this acquisition matters to me. Sophie watched as James set aside his usual professional demeanor and spoke from the heart. He told them about his father, who'd worked in a factory for 20 years before saving enough to start his own small construction company. He talked about the uncertainty his family had lived with, never knowing if the next round of layoffs would include them. I'm not here to strip your company for parts, James said. I'm here because I know what your workers are feeling right now, the fear, the uncertainty about their children's futures. I want to preserve what your family built, not destroy it. Michael Anderson, who'd been silent and hostile throughout the meeting, finally spoke. That's easy to say, but how do we know you mean it? Sophie leaned forward. Because he's been up for 3 nights straight trying to figure out how to make this work without laying off a single person. Because he turned down a more profitable deal last month because it would have meant closing a plant in a small town that couldn't survive the loss. George Anderson's eyes shifted to Sophie. And you are? Someone who knows what it's like to lose everything, Sophie said simply. Someone who's learned to recognize when a person's actions match their words. My wife has good instincts about people, James added. She saw through my reputation to who I really am. Maybe you could do the same. The meeting continued for 2 more hours, with James presenting his plans for modernizing the factory while preserving jobs, his commitment to keeping the Anderson name on the building, and his intention to promote from within rather than bringing in outside management. Finally, George Anderson looked at his son. What do you think, Michael? Michael was quiet for a long moment. I think this is different from what the other buyers offered. They wanted to buy our assets. Mr. Harrison wants to buy our future. Is that a yes? James asked carefully. George Anderson smiled for the first time all day. That's a yes. But I have one condition. Name it. I want your wife involved in the transition. Someone needs to make sure you keep your promises, and I trust her to tell me the truth. Sophie's eyes widened. Mr. Anderson, I don't know anything about business. You know about people, George said firmly. And that's what matters most. That evening, back in their penthouse, Sophie and James celebrated with champagne and take-out Chinese food. I can't believe it worked, James said, pulling Sophie close on the sofa. I can't believe you convinced them to trust me. I didn't convince them of anything, Sophie said. I just helped them see what I see, a man who cares more about doing what's right than making what's easy. James was quiet for a moment. Sophie, George was right about something. I do need someone to keep me honest, to remind me why I'm doing this. Would you consider being more involved in the business? You want me to work with you? I want you to be my partner in everything, business, life, all of it. Sophie smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. Are you offering me a job, Mr. Harrison? I'm offering you whatever you want, Mrs. Harrison, a job, a partnership, a chance to help me build something that matters. Sophie's answer was to kiss him deeply, pouring all her love and gratitude into the gesture. When they broke apart, both were breathless. I love you, she whispered against his lips. I love you too, more than I ever thought possible. As they held each other on the sofa, Sophie marveled at how much her life had changed. 6 months ago, she'd been a frightened girl with no future. Now she was a woman with a man who valued her mind as much as her heart, who wanted her as a true partner in building a life together. The foundation of their marriage was no longer just mutual loneliness and circumstance. It was trust, respect, and a love that grew stronger every day. The crisis began on a Tuesday morning in November when Sophie received a frantic phone call from Eleanor. Sophie, you have to help us. Eleanor's voice was shrill with panic. William's in the hospital. He had a heart attack, and the medical bills. We can't afford them. They're talking about putting him in a county facility. Sophie sank into the kitchen chair, her coffee growing cold as she listened to her aunt's desperate pleas. Despite everything they'd put her through, William and Eleanor were still family, the only family she had left. How bad is it? Sophie asked quietly. Bad. Really bad. The doctors say he needs surgery, but our insurance... Sophie, please. I know we weren't good to you, but you're all we have now. When James found her an hour later, Sophie was still sitting at the kitchen table, staring out at the gray November sky. "What's wrong?" he asked immediately, recognizing the signs of distress. Sophie told him about the call, watching his expression carefully. They'd been married for 5 months now, and their relationship had deepened into something beautiful and strong. But this would be their first real test. The first time Sophie's past would intrude on their present in a significant way. "Of course we'll help," James said without hesitation. Sophie blinked. "Just like that?" "Sophie, they're your family, and regardless of how they treated you, you're not the kind of person who would let someone suffer when you can help." "They sold me to you," Sophie said quietly. "They treated me like a burden for 4 years." James knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "And despite all of that, you're sitting here worried about them. That's who you are, Sophie. It's one of the reasons I love you. You don't mind? The money, I mean." James's laugh was gentle. "Sweetheart, I could pay for William's surgery every day for the rest of my life and not notice the cost. Money isn't the issue here. The question is, what do you need from me?" Sophie felt tears spring to her eyes. After months of marriage, James still had the power to surprise her with his generosity and understanding. "I need to see him," she said. "I need to know he's going to be okay. Then we'll go to the hospital." An hour later, they stood outside William's room in the cardiac unit. Through the glass window, Sophie could see her uncle connected to various machines, looking older and frailer than she remembered. Eleanor sat beside his bed, her face drawn with worry and exhaustion. "You don't have to come in," Sophie told James. "I know this is awkward." "I'm not leaving you to face this alone," James replied firmly. "We're partners, remember, in everything." When they entered the room, Eleanor looked up with surprise and relief. "Sophie? Oh, thank God you came." William was awake but weak. His eyes focused on Sophie with difficulty. "Sophie, is that really you?" "Hello, Uncle William." Sophie approached the bed cautiously. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck." William's voice was raspy. "Sophie, we need to talk." "Uncle William, you should rest." "No." William struggled to sit up slightly. "I need to say this while I can. Sophie, what we did to you, forcing you to marry him." His eyes shifted to James. "It was wrong. We were desperate. But that's no excuse." Sophie felt James's hand on her lower back, a silent show of support. "We treated you like you were nothing," William continued, his voice growing stronger. "But you were just a kid who'd lost everything. And instead of taking care of you, like we should have, we made you feel like a burden." "Uncle William, let me finish." William's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I know we don't deserve your help. I know we don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know that I'm sorry. Truly sorry." Eleanor was crying now, her shoulders shaking. "We were so wrapped up in our own problems, we forgot that you were grieving too. You lost your parents, and then you lost the family that should have loved you unconditionally." Sophie felt James's hand tighten on her back, anchoring her as emotions threatened to overwhelm her. "I forgive you," Sophie said quietly. "Both of you." "Just like that?" William asked, surprised. Sophie glanced back at James, drawing strength from his presence. "I've learned that holding on to anger only hurts the person carrying it. You made mistakes, but you were also dealing with things I didn't understand at the time." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "And if you hadn't arranged the marriage, I never would have met James. I never would have found the love and happiness I have now." Eleanor looked at James with new eyes. "He's been good to you." "He's been wonderful," Sophie said, her voice warming. "He's my best friend, my partner, and the love of my life." James stepped forward. "Mr. Carter, I want you to know that I've taken excellent care of Sophie. She's not just my wife. She's my equal partner in everything, and I'll continue to protect and cherish her for the rest of my life." William studied James's face. "You really love her." "More than my own life," James replied without hesitation. "Good." William sank back against his pillows. "That's good." Later, as they made arrangements for William's surgery and Eleanor's living expenses during his recovery, Sophie marveled at James's generosity. He not only covered all medical costs but also set up a trust fund to ensure her aunt and uncle would be financially secure for the rest of their lives. "You didn't have to do all that," Sophie said as they drove home. Yes, I did, James replied. Because it matters to you, and everything that matters to you matters to me. That night, as they lay in bed together, Sophie traced patterns on James's chest in the darkness. I keep waiting for the catch, she said quietly. What catch? This life, this marriage, you. It's all too good to be true. I keep waiting for something to go wrong. James rolled over to face her, his eyes serious in the dim light. Sophie, do you remember what you told me the night you said you loved me? You said we should stop being afraid of what this might become, and let it happen naturally. I remember. Maybe it's time to apply that same wisdom to your fears. Maybe instead of waiting for disaster, you could try trusting that some things in life really are as good as they seem. Sophie considered this. You make it sound so simple. It is simple. Not easy, but simple. You deserve happiness, Sophie. You deserve love. You deserve to feel secure in the knowledge that someone will always choose you, will always put you first. Is that what you do? Sophie asked. Put me first? Every single day, James said firmly. Every decision I make, I think about how it will affect you, how it will affect us. Sophie felt the last of her walls crumble. This man, who could have any woman in the world, chose her every day, not just chose her, but made her feel like the most precious thing in his life. I trust you, she whispered, completely. And I trust you, James replied. With my heart, my life, my future. All of it. As Sophie drifted off to sleep in James's arms, she realized that her fears had been misplaced. She'd been waiting for disaster to strike because she'd never experienced unconditional love as an adult. But James had shown her day after day that some people really do stay, some love really does last. Their first test had only made them stronger. December arrived with an early snowfall that transformed Seattle into a winter wonderland. Sophie stood at the penthouse windows, watching the flakes dance past the glass, her hands wrapped around a mug of hot chocolate that James had made with an absurd amount of marshmallows. Penny for your thoughts, James said, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. I was just thinking about Christmas, Sophie said, leaning back against his chest. This will be my first real Christmas in 5 years. What do you mean? Sophie was quiet for a moment. After my parents died, the holidays became just another day with my aunt and uncle. No tree, no presents, no celebration. They said Christmas was a waste of money we didn't have. James's arms tightened around her. Well, Mrs. Harrison, prepare yourself for the most extravagant Christmas celebration you've ever seen. Sophie turned in his arms, laughing. Please tell me you're not going to turn our home into a department store display. Nothing that gaudy, James assured her with a grin. But I may have already ordered a 12-foot Douglas fir for the living room. 12 feet? Sophie's eyes widened. James, that's enormous. It's Christmas, he said, as if that explained everything. Besides, I have 8 months of holidays to make up for Christmas, your birthday, Valentine's Day. You know when my birthday is? The 14th of February, James said. Valentine's Day, baby. Which explains a lot about your romantic nature. Sophie felt her cheeks warm. I'm not particularly romantic. You are, James insisted, spinning her around the kitchen. You leave little notes in my briefcase. You make my coffee exactly the way I like it without being asked. You curl up next to me when I'm working late, not saying anything, just keeping me company. Those aren't romantic gestures, Sophie protested, even as she giggled at his impromptu dance moves. Those are just things you do for people you care about. Exactly, James said, stopping to cup her face in his hands. Romantic things, Sophie. You have the most loving heart of anyone I've ever met. You just don't realize it because you've never had anyone appreciate it properly. Over the next 2 weeks, James threw himself into Christmas preparations with the enthusiasm of a child making up for lost time. The 12-foot tree arrived and was decorated with thousands of twinkling lights and ornaments that had been in James's family for generations. Garland adorned every doorway, and a wreath larger than Sophie was, tall, graced their front door. This is insane, Sophie laughed as James directed the hanging of Christmas stockings above the fireplace. We're only 2 people. For now, James said, and something in his tone made Sophie look at him sharply. What do you mean, for now? James's expression became suddenly vulnerable. "I mean, I hope that someday we'll have children, little ones who deserve magical Christmases and birthday parties, and all the celebrations you missed." Sophie's heart stopped. They'd never discussed children before, though she'd sometimes caught herself imagining what their babies might look like. James's gray eyes, perhaps, or her own stubborn curls. "You want children?" she asked softly. "With you, more than anything," James admitted. "But only when you're ready. Only when it's something you want, too." Sophie thought about it, imagining this beautiful home filled with the laughter of children who would be wanted and loved unconditionally, children who would never doubt their place in the world the way she had. "I do want that," she said quietly. "Someday, I want to give a child the kind of love my parents gave me, the kind of love you've given me." James's smile was radiant. "Someday," he agreed, pulling her close. "But for now, let's focus on giving you the perfect Christmas." Christmas Eve arrived with a fresh blanket of snow and a dinner party that Sophie would remember for the rest of her life. James had invited Thomas and his family, George Anderson and his son, and even some of Sophie's former co-workers from the diner, people James had tracked down because he knew they'd been kind to her during difficult times. "How did you even find them?" Sophie asked as she watched Lisa, her former manager, exclaim over the elegant dining room. "I have my ways," James said mysteriously. "I wanted you to be surrounded by people who care about you." The evening was magical. Sophie found herself laughing more than she had in years, watching James charm everyone with stories and genuine interest in their lives. When dinner was served, a feast that rivaled anything Sophie had ever seen, James stood to make a toast. "Friends," he began, raising his champagne glass, "thank you for joining us tonight to celebrate not just Christmas, but the woman who has transformed my life completely." Sophie felt her cheeks burn as all eyes turned to her. "8 months ago," James continued, "I was the loneliest man in Seattle. I had everything money could buy, and nothing that actually mattered. Then Sophie walked into my life, and suddenly I understood what people mean when they talk about miracles." "James," Sophie whispered, embarrassed by the attention. "She taught me that love isn't something you buy or negotiate or arrange," James said, his eyes locked on hers. "It's something you choose every day to give freely and receive gratefully. So tonight, I want to toast my wife, my partner, and my best friend, the woman who made me believe in Christmas magic again." The room erupted in applause and well wishes, but Sophie only had eyes for James. As the evening continued with games and carols around the piano, she found herself studying her husband's face, marveling at the joy she saw there. Later, after their guests had gone home and they were cleaning up together, Sophie couldn't stop smiling. "What?" James asked, noticing her expression. I can't believe this is my life," Sophie said. "A year ago, I was working double shifts at the diner and sleeping in an attic room that leaked when it rained. Now I'm married to the most wonderful man in the world, living in a penthouse, hosting dinner parties, having the Christmas you deserve," James added. "It's not just the luxury," Sophie said, moving closer to him. "It's being wanted, being cherished, having someone who thinks I'm worth celebrating." James set down the dish he'd been drying and pulled her into his arms. "Sophie, you are worth celebrating every single day. You're worth grand gestures and quiet moments and everything in between." Sophie stood on her tiptoes to kiss him, pouring all her love and gratitude into the gesture. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. "I have something for you," Sophie said suddenly. "Sophie, we agreed to exchange gifts tomorrow morning. This can't wait." Sophie disappeared into their bedroom and returned with a small wrapped box. "I've been working on this for weeks." James opened the box carefully, his expression shifting to wonder when he saw what was inside. It was a pocket watch, not expensive or flashy, but clearly vintage and carefully restored. When he opened it, he found a photograph of Sophie on one side and an inscription on the other. "To James, who gave me time to heal and space to grow. All my love, Sophie." "Sophie," James breathed, his voice thick with emotion. How did you—" "It was my father's," Sophie said quietly. "One of the few things I managed to keep when I moved in with my aunt and uncle. I had it restored, and I wanted you to have it. I wanted you to have something that connected you to the people who made me who I am." James stared at the watch, understanding the magnitude of the gift. This wasn't just a Christmas present. It was Sophie giving him a piece of her family, her history, her heart. "I can't accept this," he said finally. "It's too precious. It should stay with you." "It is staying with me," Sophie said, closing his fingers around the watch. "Because wherever you are, that's where my heart is." Too. James's eyes filled with tears. "I love you so much. It scares me sometimes. Good scared or bad scared?" "Good scared," James said, pulling her close. "The kind of scared that means you found something worth protecting with your life." As they stood together in their beautiful home, surrounded by the remnants of a perfect Christmas Eve, Sophie realized that she'd finally found what she'd been looking for without even knowing it. She'd found home, not a place, but a person. Not just love, but belonging. And it was more magical than any Christmas miracle she could have imagined. Spring arrived early in Seattle, painting the city in shades of green and gold that made Sophie's heart sing. She stood in the nursery of Seattle Children's Hospital, reading Charlotte's Web to a group of young patients when she felt the familiar flutter of nausea that had been plaguing her for the past week. "Miss Sophie," asked 7-year-old Lily, who was recovering from appendix surgery. "Are you okay? You look green." Sophie pressed her hand to her stomach, willing it to settle. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Maybe we should take a little break." As the children dispersed to their rooms or the play area, Sophie made her way to the bathroom, her mind racing. The nausea, the exhaustion, the way certain smells had started bothering her. Could she be pregnant? The thought both thrilled and terrified her. She and James had been married for nearly a year now, and their relationship had deepened into something beautiful and unshakable. They'd talked about children, dreamed about them. But somehow Sophie hadn't expected it to happen so soon. That afternoon, she stopped at a pharmacy on her way home, her hands trembling as she purchased a pregnancy test. Back in the penthouse, she stared at the box for 20 minutes before finally working up the courage to take it. 2 pink lines, positive. Sophie sank onto the bathroom floor, overwhelmed by a rush of emotions. Joy, fear, excitement, panic. They all warred in her chest as she stared at the test in her hands. She was going to be a mother. James was going to be a father. They were going to have a baby. "Sophie," James's voice called from the living room. "I'm home." Sophie quickly hid the test and splashed cold water on her face, trying to compose herself. How was she supposed to tell him? How did you announce something this life-changing? "There you are," James said, appearing in the bedroom doorway. He took one look at her face, and his expression shifted to concern. "What's wrong? You look pale." I need to tell you something," Sophie said, her voice barely above a whisper. James was beside her in an instant, his hands cupping her face. "You're scaring me." "What is it?" Sophie met his eyes, seeing all the love and concern there, and suddenly she knew exactly how to tell him. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the pregnancy test, placing it gently in his hands. James stared at it for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he looked up at Sophie, his eyes wide with wonder. "You're pregnant?" he whispered. Sophie nodded, tears streaming down her face. Are you happy?" James's answer was to sweep her up in his arms, spinning her around the bedroom while laughing with pure joy. When he set her down, his own eyes were bright with tears. "Happy?" he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Sophie, I'm ecstatic. I'm terrified and overwhelmed and more excited than I've ever been in my life." "Really?" Sophie asked, needing the reassurance. "Really," James confirmed, his hands moving to rest gently on her still flat stomach. "There's a baby in there." "Our baby." "Our baby," Sophie repeated, marveling at how the words sounded. That night, they lay in bed together, James's hand protectively covering Sophie's abdomen as they talked about their future. "What kind of parents do you think we'll be?" Sophie asked. "The kind who love unconditionally," James said without hesitation. "The kind who make their children feel safe and wanted and valued." "What if I don't know how? What if I mess up?" James turned to face her, his expression serious. "Sophie, you've been practicing to be a mother every weekend at the children's hospital. You have more maternal instinct in your little finger than most people have in their entire bodies. But those aren't my children. This is different. This is permanent and terrifying and perfect. Perfect, James finished. This is perfect, Sophie. Not easy, but perfect. Sophie thought about her own parents, about the love and security they'd given her for the first 15 years of her life. I want to give our child what my parents gave me. We will, James promised, and more. This child will grow up knowing they're wanted, knowing they have two parents who love each other and love them completely. Over the next few weeks, Sophie marveled at how James threw himself into pregnancy preparation with the same intensity he brought to everything else. Their home was suddenly filled with pregnancy books, healthy snacks, and prenatal vitamins. He accompanied her to every doctor's appointment, asking detailed questions and taking notes. James. Sophie laughed. After he spent an entire Saturday researching the best cribs available, the baby won't be here for 7 more months. I want everything to be perfect, James said seriously. I want our child to have the best of everything. Our child needs love more than expensive furniture, Sophie pointed out gently. They'll have that, too, James said, pulling her onto his lap. More love than they'll know what to do with. As Sophie's pregnancy progressed, she discovered reserves of strength and confidence she hadn't known she possessed. The scared 9-year-old who'd married a stranger was gone, replaced by a woman who knew she was loved, valued, and capable of anything. One evening in her second trimester, as Sophie was folding tiny baby clothes they'd started purchasing, James found her crying in the nursery they'd begun decorating. "What's wrong?" he asked immediately, kneeling beside the chair where she sat. "Nothing's wrong," Sophie said, wiping her tears. "Everything's right. That's why I'm crying." James looked confused. "I don't understand. 2 years ago, I was completely alone in the world," Sophie explained. "I had no family, no prospects, no hope. I thought my life was basically over before it had really begun. Sophie. And now look at us," she continued, gesturing around the nursery with its soft blue walls and carefully chosen furniture. "We're married. We're in love. We're having a baby. We're building a family together. Sometimes the happiness is so overwhelming, I can't contain it." James's smile was soft and understanding. "I know exactly what you mean. Sometimes I look at you and think about how close I came to never meeting you, never having this, and it takes my breath away." "Do you think our baby will be happy?" Sophie asked. "With you as their mother? How could they be anything else?" That night, as Sophie drifted off to sleep with James's hand on her growing belly, she thought about the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment. From a terrified girl being sold into marriage to a woman building a life with the love of her life, their baby would be born into love, security, and endless possibilities. And Sophie finally understood what her parents had meant when they used to say that the best things in life were worth waiting for. The call came on a rainy Thursday afternoon in Sophie's 6th month of pregnancy. She was in the nursery arranging baby books on the newly installed shelves when her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something compelled her to answer. "Mrs. Harrison, this is Rachel Thompson from Thompson & Lee Associates. I'm an attorney handling the estate of Eleanor Carter." Sophie sank into the rocking chair James had surprised her with last week. "My aunt, is she all right? I'm sorry to be the bearer of sad news, but Mrs. Carter passed away peacefully in her sleep 3 days ago. Your uncle asked me to contact you about the funeral arrangements." The phone nearly slipped from Sophie's numb fingers. Eleanor was dead. The woman who had raised her after her parents' death, who had treated her poorly but had also been her only remaining family connection, was gone. "Mrs. Harrison, are you still there?" "Yes," Sophie whispered. "I'm here. When is the funeral?" "Saturday, at 2 p.m. St. John's Catholic Church on Pine Street. But there's something else. Mrs. Harrison. Something important I need to discuss with you." Sophie pressed a hand to her growing belly, feeling the baby's responding kick. "What is it?" "Your aunt left some documents for you, a letter. And, well, I think it would be better if we discuss this in person. Could you come to my office tomorrow?" That evening, Sophie sat on the sofa with James, her head on his shoulder, as she processed the news. They'd visited William and Eleanor several times since William's heart attack, and while their relationship had improved, Sophie still felt conflicted about her aunt's death. "I should feel sadder," Sophie said quietly. She was family. "Grief isn't simple," James replied, his hand stroking her hair. "It's okay to feel conflicted about someone who was both harmful and helpful in your life. I keep thinking about the last time we saw her. She seemed different, softer somehow. People change, Sophie. Maybe she was trying to make amends in her own way." The next morning, Sophie sat across from Rachel Thompson in a downtown law office, James beside her for support. The attorney was a kind-faced woman in her 52nd who handled the situation with gentle professionalism. "Mrs. Harrison, your aunt left specific instructions for me to give you this letter after her death," Rachel said, handing Sophie a sealed envelope. "She also left you something else, but I think you should read the letter first." Sophie's hands trembled as she opened the envelope. Inside was a letter written in her aunt's careful handwriting. "Dear Sophie, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and it's time you knew the truth about everything. I've carried this secret for 5 years, and I can't take it to my grave. The night your parents died, they were coming to see William and me. Your father had discovered that William had been embezzling money from his architectural firm to cover gambling debts. Instead of turning him in, your parents wanted to help. They were bringing a check that would have allowed William to pay back what he'd stolen. They died trying to save our family's reputation and William's freedom. When you came to live with us, we were drowning in guilt and shame. Every time we looked at you, we saw our failure, our responsibility for your parents' death. We treated you badly because we couldn't face what we'd done. The marriage arrangement with Mr. Harrison, it wasn't just about money, though we did need it desperately. I researched him extensively. Sophie. I knew he was a good man, a kind man who would take care of you in ways we never could. I hoped that maybe we could give you something good to make up for everything we'd taken away. I know this doesn't excuse how we treated you. Nothing could excuse that. But I needed you to know that your parents died as heroes, trying to save family who didn't deserve their sacrifice. I also need you to know that we love you. We always have. We just didn't know how to show it through our guilt and shame. There's something else, a safety deposit box your parents maintained, that we never told you about. Rachel has the key and instructions. Your parents left things for you, things I thought it would be too painful for you to have as a child. I hope you can forgive us someday. I hope you can understand that everything we did, wrong as it was, came from people who were drowning and didn't know how to swim. With love and regret, Eleanor." Sophie stared at the letter, tears streaming down her face. James's arm came around her shoulders, anchoring her as the revelations crashed over her. "Sophie," Rachel said gently, "are you all right?" "My parents were trying to help them," Sophie whispered. "They died because they were trying to save my uncle." "It appears so," Rachel confirmed. "And Mrs. Carter wanted you to have this." She handed Sophie a small key and a paper with an address. "The safety deposit box contains items your parents left for you, as well as some things your aunt thought you should have." An hour later, Sophie and James stood in the bank vault, staring at the contents of the safety deposit box. There were letters from her parents written to her on every birthday since she was born, intended to be given to her as she grew up. There were photographs from her childhood that she thought had been lost, her mother's jewelry, her father's watch, the companion to the one Sophie had given James for Christmas. But it was the final letter that broke Sophie's heart and healed it simultaneously, written by her mother just days before the accident. "My dearest Sophie, if you're reading this, something has happened to your father and me. I hope that by now you've grown into the amazing woman I know you'll become. I want you to know that loving you has been the greatest joy of our lives. Watching you grow, seeing your kindness and strength develop, has been a privilege beyond measure. If we're gone, I know you'll face challenges and heartbreak, but I also know you'll face them with courage and grace. You have so much love to give, sweetheart. Don't be afraid to give it freely when the right person comes along. Find someone who sees your worth, who cherishes your heart, who makes you feel safe to be completely yourself. And when you do, love them with everything you have. Love is the only thing that makes life worth living. We'll always be with you in every act of kindness you show, every moment of joy you experience, every love you give and receive. Forever yours, Mom." Sophie clutched the letter to her chest, sobbing as years of grief and confusion finally found resolution. James held her as she cried, his own eyes wet with tears. "She knew," Sophie whispered. "Somehow she knew I'd find love again. She knew because she raised a daughter capable of incredible love," James said softly. "She knew because she could see your heart." That evening, back in their penthouse, Sophie sat in the nursery reading her mother's words aloud to her unborn child. "Your grandmother sounds like an amazing woman," James said from the doorway. "She was, and she would have loved you." Sophie looked up at him with wonder. "James, do you realize what this means? Eleanor didn't just randomly choose you for the marriage. She researched you. She picked you specifically because she thought you'd be good to me." James came to sit beside her in the rocking chair. Maybe she was trying to give you the love she couldn't. Maybe she was trying to fix what her family had broken. Sophie leaned into James's embrace, one hand on her belly where their child was growing, the other clutching the letters that had finally brought her peace about her past. "I forgive them," she said quietly. "Eleanor and William, I understand now. Your parents would be proud of you," James said, "and they'd be proud of the family we're building." Sophie smiled through her tears. "I think so too." As they sat together in the soft glow of the nursery lamp, Sophie realized that everything in her life had led to this moment. Her parents' love had shaped her capacity for forgiveness. Her aunt and uncle's mistakes had led her to James, and now they were creating new life, new love, new possibilities. Sometimes the most broken roads led to the most beautiful destinations. The contractions started at 3 a.m. on a snowy December morning, exactly 1 week before their baby's due date. Sophie woke with a gasp, her hand immediately flying to her swollen belly as pain radiated through her lower back. "James," she breathed, shaking her husband's shoulder. "James, wake up." He was instantly alert, the way he'd been for the past month, ready for this moment. "Is it time?" "I think so," Sophie said, then cried out as another contraction hit. Stronger than the first. James was up and moving immediately, grabbing the hospital bag they'd packed weeks ago, calling Dr. Larson, and helping Sophie into her robe. His hands were steady, but Sophie could see the barely controlled excitement and terror in his eyes. "It's going to be okay," he kept saying, more to himself than to her. "Everything's going to be fine." The drive to the hospital was surreal. Seattle was blanketed in fresh snow, the city quiet and peaceful in the early morning hours. Sophie gripped James's hand as another contraction washed over her, marveling at how everything looked the same when her entire world was about to change. "Are you scared?" she asked James as they waited for the elevator in the maternity ward. "Terrified," he admitted, "and more excited than I've ever been in my life." The next 12 hours were a blur of pain, anticipation, and overwhelming love. James never left Sophie's side, holding her hand through every contraction, whispering words of encouragement, and looking at her like she was performing miracles. "You're amazing," he kept saying. "You're so strong, Sophie. I love you so much. Doctor." Larson was calm and reassuring, monitoring Sophie's progress and assuring them that everything was proceeding normally. But as the hours stretched on, Sophie began to tire, her body exhausted from the intensity of labor. "I can't do this," she gasped during a particularly difficult contraction. "It's too much." "Yes, you can," James said firmly, his face close to hers. "Sophie, you are the strongest person I know. You survived losing your parents. You survived years of feeling unwanted. You survived marrying a stranger. You can absolutely do this. But what if something goes wrong? What if I'm not a good mother? What if—" "Stop," James interrupted gently. "Sophie, look at me." Through tears of pain and exhaustion, Sophie met his eyes. "You are going to be an extraordinary mother," James said with absolute conviction. "This baby is already so loved, already so wanted, and we're going to figure out everything else together, just like we always do." "Promise-me," Sophie said desperately. "Promise me that no matter what happens, you'll love this baby enough for both of us." "Nothing is going to happen," James said fiercely. "But I promise I'll love our child with everything I have. And I promise I'll love you through whatever comes next." At 4:47 p.m., after 13 hours of labor, Thomas James Harrison entered the world with a loud cry that filled the delivery room with joy. Sophie collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted but triumphant as Dr. Larson placed their son on her chest. "Oh my God," Sophie breathed, staring at the tiny, perfect face of their baby. "James, look at him." James was crying openly, his hand gently touching their son's tiny fist. "He's perfect, Sophie. He's absolutely perfect." Thomas had James's gray eyes and Sophie's delicate features, a perfect blend of both parents. As Sophie held him for the first time, she felt a love so fierce and protective that it took her breath away. "Hello, baby boy," she whispered. "We've been waiting for you." Over the next few days in the hospital, Sophie and James marveled at how their lives had been completely transformed by 8 pounds of humanity. Thomas was a good baby, alert and calm, seeming to study the world around him with curious eyes. "He looks like you when you're thinking," Sophie told James as they watched their son sleep in the hospital bassinet. "He has your stubborn chin," James replied, his finger gently stroking Thomas's cheek. On their second night in the hospital, Sophie woke to find James sitting in the chair beside her bed, holding Thomas and speaking to him in a soft voice. "Your mommy is the most amazing woman in the world," James was saying. "She's brave and kind and beautiful, and she's going to teach you so many important things like how to be generous with your heart, how to stand up for what's right, and how to love people even when they don't deserve it." Sophie's heart swelled as she listened. "And I'm going to teach you how to be a good man," James continued. "How to treat people with respect, how to work hard for what you believe in, and how to protect the people you love. But most importantly, we're both going to make sure you always know how wanted you are, how loved you are." "He's lucky to have you as a father," Sophie said softly. James looked up, surprised to find her awake. "I'm the lucky one. Both of you are the best things that ever happened to me." "Come here," Sophie said, patting the narrow hospital bed beside her. James carefully settled next to her, Thomas still cradled in his arms. The three of them fit perfectly together, a family complete. "I keep thinking about my parents," Sophie said quietly, "how much they would have loved him." "They do love him," James said with certainty. "And they love you. I can feel it, Sophie. All that love you talked about, all that foundation they gave you, it's still here. It's part of who you are as a mother." Sophie looked down at her son's sleeping face, seeing echoes of her own features mixed with James's. "He's going to have such a different childhood than I did after 15. "He's going to have the childhood you deserved," James corrected. "Stable, loving parents who put him first. Security, education, opportunities, but most importantly, the knowledge that he's cherished. Are we going to be good at this?" Sophie asked. The magnitude of parenthood suddenly overwhelming. "We're going to make mistakes," James said honestly, "but we're going to make them together, and we're going to fix them together. And through it all, Thomas is going to know he's loved unconditionally." Sophie leaned her head against James's shoulder, watching their son sleep peacefully in his father's arms. "I love you," she whispered. "Both of you, more than I ever thought possible." "We love you too," James replied. "Our beautiful, strong, amazing wife and mother." As snow continued to fall outside the hospital window, Sophie realized that this was the moment she'd been waiting for her entire life without knowing it. Not just to become a mother, but to complete the family she'd always dreamed of having. Thomas stirred in James's arms, his tiny hand grasping at the air before settling back into sleep. Sophie caught his little fist in her finger, marveling at the strength in his grip. Their son was here. Their family was complete. And Sophie finally understood what it meant to have everything you'd ever wanted in the whole world, sleeping peacefully in your arms. The greatest test of their love hadn't been the difficult marriage circumstances or the family drama or even the challenges of pregnancy. It had been learning to trust that this much happiness was really theirs to keep. And looking at her husband and son, Sophie knew with absolute certainty that it was. Sophie stood at the kitchen window of their suburban home, watching 5-year-old Thomas play in the backyard with his little sister, 3-year-old Lily. The house was smaller than the penthouse they'd left behind 3 years ago, but it was perfect for their family. 4 bedrooms, a large yard, and most importantly, it felt like home in a way the penthouse never had. "Mommy, look," Thomas called, holding up a dandelion he'd picked for her. "It's beautiful like you." Sophie's heart melted as it did countless times every day. Thomas had grown into a thoughtful, intelligent boy with James's analytical mind and Sophie's compassionate heart. Lily, meanwhile, was a whirlwind of energy with curly blonde hair and a mischievous smile that could get her out of any trouble. "That's lovely, sweetheart," Sophie called back. "Add it to the bouquet for Daddy." James would be home any minute from the office, and the children had spent the afternoon creating a surprise bouquet of weeds that they were convinced was the most beautiful thing ever created. Sophie had learned that the secret to happiness wasn't expensive flowers. It was dandelions picked by chubby little hands and presented with boundless love. The front door opened just as Sophie was setting the table for dinner, and she heard the sound she looked forward to every day, Thomas and Lily shrieking, "Daddy," and running to greet James at the door. "There are my favorite people." James's voice carried through the house, warm with the contentment that had characterized their life together. "Did you save any energy for your old dad?" "You're not old, Daddy." Lily's voice was indignant. "You're just grown up." Sophie smiled as she heard James's laughter. At 54, he was more handsome than ever, his hair now completely silver, but his eyes still bright with the joy that had transformed him from a lonely businessman into a devoted husband and father. "Mommy, Daddy's home," Thomas announced as if Sophie hadn't heard the commotion. "I noticed," Sophie said, wiping her hands on her apron as James appeared in the kitchen doorway, Lily perched on his shoulders and Thomas clinging to his leg. "Beautiful chaos, as always," James said, his eyes meeting Sophie's over their children's heads. The look that passed between them was full of shared love, inside jokes, and the deep contentment of two people who had built something wonderful together. "How was your day?" Sophie asked, reaching up to kiss him as he bent down, Lily giggling at being so high up. "Better now," James replied, the answer he'd given every day for the past 5 years. Over dinner, Thomas regaled them with stories from kindergarten, while Lily attempted to eat more food than she wore, which was no small challenge. Sophie and James exchanged amused glances as their daughter explained very seriously why vegetables taste better when you squish them first. "Daddy," Thomas said suddenly, his 5-year-old face serious, "Bobby's parents are getting divorced." "What does that mean?" Sophie felt her heart skip, but James handled the question with the same patience he brought to all of their children's curiosities. "It means they've decided they don't want to be married anymore," James explained gently. "Sometimes that happens with grown-ups." "Will you and Mommy get divorced?" Lily asked, her blue eyes wide with concern. "Never," Sophie and James said simultaneously, their voices so certain that both children visibly relaxed. "But how do you know?" Thomas pressed. Sophie looked at James, seeing the same thought in his eyes that was in her own mind. "How did you explain to children that some love stories were written in permanent ink?" "Because," James said carefully, "your mother and I are best friends. We like spending time together. We help each other, and we love each other more every day instead of less. Plus," Sophie added, "we made a promise to each other, and we're the kind of people who keep our promises." "What kind of promise?" Lily asked. "We promise to choose each other every day," Sophie said. "Even when things are hard, even when we disagree about something, we choose to work it out together instead of giving up." "Like when Daddy burns the pancakes?" Thomas asked, remembering the previous Sunday's breakfast disaster. "Exactly like that," James laughed. "Mommy could have gotten mad, but instead she helped me make new ones. And when Mommy was sad about Aunt Eleanor dying, Daddy held her and made her feel better," Lily added, her 3-year-old wisdom surprising them all. "That's right, baby girl," Sophie said, her throat tightening with emotion. "That's what people do when they love each other. They help each other through the sad times and celebrate together during the happy times." After dinner, as they went through the familiar routine of baths, stories, and bedtime kisses, Sophie found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 5 years ago, she'd been a terrified teenager, forced into marriage with a stranger. Now she was 24, confident, loved, and the mother of 2 amazing children with the man of her dreams. "Mommy," Thomas said as Sophie tucked him into his spaceship bed, "tell me the story about how you and Daddy met." It had become their favorite bedtime story, though Sophie always edited it for young ears. "Well," she began, settling beside him on the narrow bed, "once upon a time, there was a very lonely man who lived in a tall tower in the city. Like a prince," Lily called from her room next door. Like a prince, Sophie agreed. And there was a girl who felt very alone in the world because she'd lost her family. But then they found each other, Thomas continued, knowing the story by heart. They found each other, Sophie confirmed. And at first they were both scared, because they didn't know if they could trust their hearts again. But slowly, day by day, they discovered that they were meant to be together. And then they had us. Lily's voice was full of joy. The most beautiful part of the story, Sophie said, her heart full. They had 2 wonderful children who made their family complete. After the children were finally asleep, Sophie found James in their bedroom, looking through photo albums from the past 5 years. Their entire life was documented there. Thomas's first steps, Lily's first word, which had been Daddy, much to James's delight. Family vacations, Christmas mornings, ordinary Tuesday afternoons that had been made extraordinary by love. Remember this? James said, pointing to a picture of Sophie at Thomas's first birthday party. She was laughing at something off camera, her hair caught by the wind, Thomas smearing cake all over his face in her arms. I remember everything, Sophie said, settling beside him on their bed. Every moment of the past 5 years has been a gift, even the sleepless nights when the kids were babies. Especially those, James said. There was something magical about being up at 3 o'clock a.m. With you, both of us exhausted, but so happy. Like we were the only people in the world. Sophie melted into his embrace without hesitation, home in the place she'd always belonged. Do you ever regret it? James asked quietly. Marrying me instead of having a normal courtship, a normal wedding, a choice in the matter? Sophie pulled back to look at him, surprised by the question. James Harrison, how can you ask me that after 5 years? Because sometimes I look at you and think about all the things you missed, dating, falling in love gradually, choosing your own husband. I did choose my own husband, Sophie interrupted firmly. Maybe not at first, but every day since then, I've chosen you. When I chose to trust you on our wedding night, when I chose to open my heart to you, when I chose to build this life with you, those were all my choices. But if you could go back and do it differently, I wouldn't change a single thing, Sophie said with absolute conviction. James, if I'd had a normal courtship with a normal man, I never would have had you. I never would have had Thomas and Lily. I never would have learned that the greatest love stories aren't always the ones that begin with choice. Sometimes they're the ones that begin with faith. James's eyes were bright with unshed tears. I love you so much, Sophie, more now than on our wedding day. More than yesterday, but not as much as I will tomorrow. Promise me something, Sophie said, echoing the words he'd spoken to her on their wedding night. Anything. Promise me we'll keep choosing each other. When we're old and gray, when the kids are grown and gone, when it's just us again, promise me we'll still choose each other every day. I promise, James said solemnly. Forever and always, Sophie Harrison. You're stuck with me. Good, Sophie said, settling back into his arms. Because I have plans for us, grandchildren to spoil, anniversaries to celebrate, adventures to have, 50 more years of choosing each other. Only 50? James teased. Fine. Forever. Sophie laughed. I choose you forever. As they lay together in the darkness of their bedroom, Sophie listened to the sounds of their home. Thomas talking to his stuffed animals, Lily singing herself to sleep, the dishwasher running in the kitchen, the gentle tick of the grandfather clock James had inherited from his parents. These were the sounds of a life well lived, a family built on a foundation of unexpected love that had grown stronger with each passing day. Sophie thought about her parents, about how proud they would be of the woman she'd become and the family she'd created. She thought about Eleanor, who, in her imperfect way, had given Sophie the greatest gift of all by choosing James as her husband. She thought about all the lonely nights and fearful days that had led her to this moment. Thank you, she whispered into the darkness. For what? James asked sleepily. For seeing me, for choosing me, for loving me enough to wait for me to love you back. Thank you, James replied. For saving me from a life without purpose, for giving me a family, for making me the luckiest man alive. Outside their window, Seattle glittered in the distance, the city where they'd met, married, and fallen in love. But Sophie no longer needed the bright lights and endless possibilities of the city. Everything she needed was right here in this suburban house, in this bed, in this man's arms. 5 years ago, Sophie Carter had walked down an aisle toward an uncertain future with a stranger. Tonight, Sophie Harrison fell asleep in the arms of her best friend, the father of her children, and the great love of her life. Sometimes the most beautiful journeys begin with a single step into the unknown. Sometimes the greatest love stories start with the words, "I do," spoken in faith, rather than certainty. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, the life you never planned turns out to be exactly the life you were meant to live. Sophie smiled as sleep claimed her, James's arms around her, and the sounds of their children's breathing from down the hall. Tomorrow would bring new adventures, new challenges, new joys. But tonight, she was exactly where she belonged. In 5 years, they had built more than a marriage. They had built a legacy of love that would last for generations. And it all began with a frightened girl who chose to trust a lonely man who chose to be worthy of that trust,